Here's the story of how I started collecting stamps and the history behind that first stamp. It's hard to believe that it's been 60 years since I began my first stamp collection, but here we are. I was 7 years old when I decided to become a stamp collector. Little did I know that the hobby would provide a lifetime of pure enjoyment. Every summer in my childhood, I spent a week at my grandmother Turner's house. One day, we walked up the hill to the mailbox to get the mail. At that time, every piece of mail included a postage stamp. Most of the stamps were boring old men. That day, I noticed a stamp that was different from all the others. This one had a soldier and a cannon, a visual delight for a 7-year-old boy. This is the stamp that inspired me to become a stamp collector. The Pray for Peace cancel on a postally used Scott number 1178. On April the 12th, 1961, the U.S. Post Office issued the first stamp in a 5-year series honoring major events from the Civil War. Although this stamp was issued in April of 1961, I didn't discover it until June of that year. Prior to this, the post office hadn't issued stamps to commemorate any specific Civil War battles, though several stamps had been issued honoring generals from both sides of the war. Here's a plate number block of 4 stamps. The first stamp in the series was issued on the 100th anniversary of that battle. The stamp was issued at the Charleston, South Carolina Post Office. Here are all 4 plate positions in the plate blocks. This is a mint sheet of 50 stamps of the Civil War Centennial Fort Sumter stamp. This is a grade 100 stamp with a certificate from professional stamp experts. Based on a Harper's Weekly illustration from the time, it pictures a seacoast gun from the fort, manned by an officer in the typical uniform. Behind this are palmetto leaves. The palmetto is South Carolina's state tree, and the state's nickname is the Palmetto State. The connection dates back to the Revolutionary War. Here is the drawing from Harper's Weekly that inspired the design of the stamp. Now that we've seen the history behind my first stamp, let's take a look back at the history of the events at Fort Sumter. The day after Christmas, rowboats sliced quietly across Charleston Harbor under cover of darkness. South Carolina had seceded 6 days earlier, leaving Union Major General Robert Anderson and his group of 127 men stranded at Fort Moultrie, deep within rebel territory. Fort Moultrie, built before the American Revolution, was made of palmetto logs, the state tree of South Carolina. The battle flag of Fort Sumter is also pictured here. The fort was named after Thomas Sumter, a hero of the American Revolution. Anderson and his troops left Fort Moultrie, which was impossible to defend, for the daring journey to nearby Fort Sumter, which was one of the strongest garrisons in the world at the time. As the sun rose, Anderson's men proudly hoisted the stars and stripes over Fort Sumter, where it waved above the entrance to South Carolina's most important port city. South Carolina Governor Francis W. Pickens was outraged. President Buchanan had promised him Fort Sumter would remain unoccupied. Yet the merchant ship Star of the West was sent to Fort Sumter to supply Anderson with food, small arms, and 200 men. Fearing this was the assault they'd expected since secession, rebels rushed to Charleston by the thousands to man shore batteries and fire at the ship. Hoping to prevent war, Major Anderson decided against using Sumter's artillery to protect the Star of the West. The fort is located on Sullivan's Island at the entrance to the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter was of little strategic importance to the United States. It was incomplete, and all 60 of its guns faced the sea. However, it became a symbol of national unity. To President Lincoln, giving up the fort meant accepting secession. Having hostile troops in control of Charleston Harbor was a serious threat to the Confederacy, which made their removal a top priority. President Jefferson Davis ordered Beauregard to demand the surrender of Fort Sumter and destroy the facility if any supplies were brought to the Federal troops. Construction of the fort began in 1829 and was still in progress in 1861 when the Civil War began. Waving a white flag, Confederates Stephen D. Lee and James Chestnut, Jr. rowed across Charleston Harbor to deliver the ultimatum on the afternoon of April the 11th, 1861. Anderson refused. Quote, "I shall wait for the first shot, and if you do not batter us to pieces, we shall be starved out in a few days." End quote. Beauregard was instructed to withhold fire if Anderson would set a date for evacuation. If not, he was told to reduce the fort as your judgment decides to be most practicable. In the early morning hours of April 12th, Lee and Chestnut were sent across the harbor again to present Anderson with a way to avoid bloodshed. Anderson agreed to evacuate by noon on the 15th, unless new orders or supplies were received, but didn't pledge to withhold fire. This is exactly what Beauregard had been ordered to prevent. Anderson was told shots would be fired in 1 hour. He shook hands with the Confederate messengers, saying, "If we ever meet in this world again, God grant that we may meet in the next." A single shot was fired at Fort Sumter at 4:30 a.m., followed by more at 2-minute intervals. Union ships bearing supplies lay nearby, but were held at bay by the artillery. Beauregard's forces heated cannonballs and fired them deliberately into wooden buildings on Fort Sumter. The fort became an inferno, threatening to explode the facility's stores of gunpowder. At noon the following day, a Charleston newspaper reported the entire roof of the barracks at Fort Sumter are in a vast sheet of flame. Shells from Cummings Point and Fort Moultrie are bursting in and over Fort Sumter in quick succession. The Federal flag still waves. Major Anderson is only occupied in putting out the fire. Every shot on Fort Sumter now seems to tell heavily. Aside from being short on supplies, Anderson's troops were also stymied by the original design of Fort Sumter. Built in the aftermath of the War of 1812 to defend against a naval attack, Sumter's guns pointed outward toward the sea rather than inland. Starved, outmanned, and outgunned, the men of Fort Sumter agreed to a truce and lowered the United States flag at 2 p.m. on April the 13th. So far, there had been no casualties on either side. While Anderson was firing a 50-gun salute to his flag, an ember fell into some powder. 1 man was killed in the explosion and 5 were injured. Private Daniel Huff thus became the first fatality of the war before a man had fallen in combat. As the weary artillerymen passed silently out of the harbor, Confederate soldiers lining the beaches removed their caps in salute. There was no cheering. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 troops to preserve the Union, rallying Northerners and prompting 4 additional states to secede. Charleston Harbor remained in Confederate hands for the rest of the war, leaving a gap in the Union blockade. The Civil War had begun. After the Civil War, Fort Sumter was partially rebuilt. It served as a lighthouse until additional construction and a new battery were taken on in anticipation of the Spanish-American War. Work was not finished until after the war, however. Though it was fitted with rifles during World War I and anti-aircraft guns during World War II, by the 20th century, Fort Sumter had become old-fashioned and its defenses were mostly outdated. Its guns were removed in 1943. On April 28, 1948, the fort was transferred to the National Park Service and became Fort Sumter National Monument. When the Civil War erupted, the country was on the verge of bankruptcy. Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase originally planned to finance the war with loans, but early Union losses threatened investor confidence. A plan evolved to generate internal revenue, money collected from domestic items such as tobacco, alcohol, medicine, perfume, and playing cards. Stamps were provided as proof of payment. The government required several unusual cancellation techniques such as private cancels, manuscript initials, and perforated initials. The same legislation that created these stamps also created the Internal Revenue Service and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Today we saw the story of how I started collecting stamps and the history behind that first stamp. If you enjoyed this presentation, be sure to check out Part 2, The Covers of Fort Sumter, coming later this summer. We will take an in-depth look at the first day of issue covers and cachets for the Fort Sumter Centennial Stamp. Thank you for your time in viewing this presentation. Be sure to click on the subscribe button and ring the bell to be notified of future presentations. We welcome your comments and feedback on the show.